they knew that the products that they were using to treat people with blood-related disorders were bad. They knew that they were contaminated with hepatitis, or that there was a very high risk of that. And they knew that some of the sources that they were getting the blood products from, the US and Austria, had higher risk of incidence of those kind of problems. There is a certain naivety in that view, the idea that everybody working within it has only the best intentions. And actually what we know from the scandal is places like Traylor, the school where there were a large number of children with haemophilia, the clinicians experimented on them like Nazi war doctors. Well, a market in itself is a form of transparency, so you can tell which the better products are by what people are choosing to buy. So it simply wouldn't be the case that the NHS would only buy the cheapest product available, which in this case would have come from people on what somebody wrote in the book, Skid Row in the US. It would have come from people who would provide reliable products which didn't cause problems.
Earlier this week, the Infected Blood Inquiry published its findings. More than 30,000 people in the UK were infected with HIV and hepatitis C after being given contaminated blood products in the 1970s and the 80s. A public inquiry described the scale of the scandal as horrifying and accused doctors, the government and the NHS of repeatedly failing patients. After being given the infected treatments, about 1,250 people in the UK with bleeding disorders developed both HIV and hepatitis C, including 380 children. In total, it is thought that about 2,900 people had sadly lost their lives as a result. Announcing the findings, the inquiry said that victims had been failed not once but repeatedly, and that the risk of viral infections in blood products had been known since 1948. Inquiry Chairman Sir Brian Langstaff said that there had been a lack of openness from the authorities and elements of downright deception, including the destruction of documents. He said half-truths were also told, so people did not know about the risk of their treatment, the availability of alternatives, or even whether they had been infected in the first place. This disaster was not an incident, is what he said exactly, and that the infections happened because those in authority, doctors, the blood services, and successive governments did not put patient safety first. Could the blood inquiry and could the scandal have been avoided in the first place? Could we have actually introduced institutional mechanisms that would have prevented this and promoted further transparency and potentially have saved some of those lives? Welcome back to the IEA Podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I am the Communications Officer and Linda Wetson Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Each week on the podcast, we ask a tantalising policy question. This week's question: why did the NHS cover up the infected blood scandal? I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Andy Mayer, who is our COO and energy analyst. Andy, could you tell me a little bit about the scandal, what actually happened, and why do you think that this was potentially avoidable?
So, to start with, the most important point raised by the scandal is just how many people have been hurt or killed by this entirely avoidable and regrettable series of decisions, not just by clinicians and the people running the NHS, but by politicians of all parties who, rather than think about the patients, think about what their families needed, decided instead the appropriate response was one of institutional cover-up for decades. The inquiry is an extremely well-written 300-page report in its totality, and that refers to thousands upon thousands of witness statements taken over a very long period of time, and prior inquiries that also resulted in the various stages that were needed to get to arrive at this point. Now, all that said, even now, what is frustrating the inquiry is the government has still not agreed what compensation they're going to pay both to the direct victims, those killed, those maimed, and also their families who have suffered with this inexcusable degree of incompetence for such a long period of time. Now, we are not clinicians. At the IEA, our job is to look at economic solutions to public policy problems. So we're not going to get too far into the clinical detail of the report. But what we can note is that many of the things that the politicians thought they needed to say about this when they were avoiding taking responsibility was simply untrue. So it is not the case, for example, that this was inadvertent. The report's very clear on this. They knew that the products that they were using to treat people with blood-related disorders were bad. They knew that they were contaminated with hepatitis, or that there was a very high risk of that. And they knew that some of the sources that they were getting the blood products from, the US and Austria, had higher risk of incidence of those kind of problems. So they could have avoided this. They chose not to, and they did so on a very cold and calculating basis that somebody suffering from a blood disorder like haemophilia might prefer the risk of a product that would potentially stop them from bleeding to death to what they thought, they say, was the much lower risk of something like hepatitis B. It wasn't fully exposed why this was a terrible line of reasoning until the AIDS crisis. So back in the 1960s and 70s, they knew hepatitis was a problem, but they thought it was a low incidence problem, something that you recovered from. They were aware at the time of something they were calling non-A, non-B hepatitis, which later turned out to be diagnosed as hepatitis C in 1988. But at the time they thought hepatitis, it's going to get into the bloodstream through the pooling of various resources that were forming the plasma-related products. And they decided that was okay because people would recover from hepatitis B or similar. But that was a terrible judgment. They already knew there were markers that people in that pool were suffering from higher rates of things like liver disease, things that really are desperately dangerous and can kill you. Hepatitis C is an incredibly serious illness. So rather than fully investigate those things, they decided to ignore them to deal with the short-term problem that was created in the UK of undersupply of blood and blood products. And that's where the economics of this starts to come in. So when we were looking into the reports and looking back at the IEA's history of engagement on issues around the NHS, we discovered that there was a book called The Price of Blood. And that was a debate between the IEA and someone called Titmuss, who was a founding father of sociology and someone who believed very much in the voluntary model of the NHS, the idea that it was a superior model to have people donate blood voluntarily, and thereby you would encourage an altruistic moral society where everybody was involved in the delivery of socialised medicine. Arthur Selden, our founding head of research and editorial director, looked into that and said, well, actually, no, what you need to do is have a market for blood, one where the price mechanism will more closely match supply and demand. And he's been proven correct by time on that. We do now have a market for such things in the NHS, and we don't have a similar issue of undersupply. The UK itself has never been able to produce all of the blood supplies that we need, and we have always been to some degree reliant on things like trade with other countries, or more recently, things like artificial blood products, recombinant plasma, for example.
Because in the same way that we can't produce everything domestically, we also can't necessarily rely on domestic suppliers of blood and blood donors. I think what's interesting about this, just thinking about the inquiry itself and the fact that it found that there was a very intentional, very purposeful institutional mechanism, which effectively meant that the scandal itself was being covered up. Why do you think that is, and what is the difference there between a large state monopoly like the National Health Service that doesn't have those institutional mechanisms that allows for transparency? Why is that, and why is there that difference?
Well, this is really basic public choice economics. When someone like Titmuss was arguing about the moral purpose of organisations like the NHS, there is a certain naivety in that view, the idea that everybody working within it has only the best intentions. And actually what we know from the scandal is places like Traylor, the school where there were a large number of children with haemophilia, the clinicians experimented on them like Nazi war doctors. I mean, it's appalling. And they did that because they thought they were working for some greater moral purpose and greater good. So Titmuss wasn't exactly wrong, but he was just confusing the idea of having a higher purpose with it being a good purpose. And markets are neutral on this point. We don't assume as free marketeers that people who work in the private sector are good and people who work in the public sector are bad, or the converse. What we look at is whether free market mechanisms can be used to stop problems like this happening. And if they can't, can they help resolve them more quickly? Are the incentives there to ensure that these things get dealt with? So when there's a scandal in the private sector, and there are scandals, the role of the state is to act as the neutral arbiter through the system of rule of law to ensure that those scandals are dealt with. But when the state itself is the provider of services, it has an interest in the outcome. And this is what repetitively happened. The Treasury decided that compensation would be unbearable for this scandal. I mean, it's almost comical in the darkest possible way that one of the earliest signs of this, they thought they might have to pay £3 million of compensation.
Yeah.
Well, they're now looking at 10 billion or more. And at every stage, that motivation to save the exchequer money so that it could do the other things it wanted to do, and to save the blushes of the clinicians who made terrible decisions, was the priority. But we know that that is what happens in state institutions because the people working at them have their own interests. If they've got the power to enforce those interests through a cover-up, their instinct often is to do that.
And they're actively incentivized to cover up those kind of scandals, right? I mean, and I suppose from a public choice theory perspective, you can't take away an individual's self-interest as they enter the public sphere. A private individual has their own self-interest just as much as they do in the private sector as they do in the public sector. And within the...
Let's look at the individuals involved here. So not named individuals, the report does that and people can read it. But the politicians, it's very easy as a politician to kick the can down the road. If you're a minister, you're quite likely to be into a different job within the space of 2 years.
Yeah.
Very few ministers did what Jeremy Hunt did and stay a very long time, particularly in the health department, which is extremely difficult to run. So every minister involved in this up until those who actually decided to take the inquiry forward decided, well, can be somebody else's problem. I mean, they reluctantly, stage by stage, agreed that they did need to give people compensation. So the AIDS victims, to start with, were the ones who first got compensated in part. But it was only after that that the hepatitis problem started emerging on scale. And then, again, it took a decade or more to start taking that seriously. And there was just no sensible analysis which said, we have done something terrible and wrong. We need to get to the truth of it. We need to identify what we could do better. And we need to compensate those people who could well be dead by the time we get around to doing it. So we need to do so quickly and fairly. And that is the role of the state. But they failed. And they failed catastrophically because they were looking after their own individual interests. The clinicians, I mean, some of the people who went out to the US in the 1970s when they were looking at these products, they knew there were problems. It wasn't the case that they were ignorant of the viral risk, just didn't think it mattered.
Yeah.
And some of the arguments that have come from this that just said, oh, it's all about private American healthcare. Well, rubbish. I mean, the issues in the products that were being developed were well known, and those companies were also trying their best to come up with solutions. So some of the early research on the heat treatment that resolved some of the problem.
Some of the HIV problem.
Killing the virus.
Yeah.
So it didn't really matter whether it was the HIV virus
or
the hepatitis. The heat treatment to about 70 degrees was what made some of those products safer until they were replaced entirely. But they just decided that didn't matter. It was just a lower risk than the thing that they were looking at and what they needed to do, which was solve a short-term supply issue.
Okay. And so from that perspective, so there's a short-term supply issue of blood, and then we begin importing blood products from abroad. Why is there then that difference in institutional mechanisms for that kind of transparency? And if that is the case, and if it is the case that under a National Health Service, under a state monopoly, there isn't those incentives to be more transparent, what is the solution? How do we then enter a market? How do we then implement market mechanisms which then incentivize that kind of transparency, or indeed that the problems are then solved more quickly?
Well, a market in itself is a form of transparency, so you can tell which the better products are by what people are choosing to buy. So it simply wouldn't be the case that the NHS would only buy the cheapest product available, which in this case would have come from people on what somebody wrote in the book, Skid Row in the US. It would have come from people who were providing reliable products which didn't cause problems. And one of the issues, for example, was pool size.
Yeah.
And pool size is the number of donors from which the products are being extracted that are then mixed together. And clearly, if you've got one person in that pool whose load is virally infected, they're going to contaminate a vast amount of product if the pool size is large. So where, for example, you are dealing with children with haemophilia, you would automatically be looking for a more expensive, higher quality product with much lower risk of viral load, even back then, because you didn't want to risk somebody who had otherwise had no exposure to any other form of risk of this type, of getting that virus that they could have otherwise avoided.
Yeah, I think that's interesting from that perspective. And so in the 60s, the IEA came out with the price of blood, which effectively argued that in order to address these supply issues, we should look at introducing those market mechanisms. Could you tell me a little bit about what the Hobart paper actually argues, and why you think that this kind of solution actually could have addressed the supply issue instead of just the current what actually happened, which was the importation of blood products from abroad without that kind of transparency?
So there's two separate arguments. One is a quite weird argument about self-sufficiency, the idea that the UK should have been entirely dependent on its own population for its source of blood and blood products. And that's an interesting argument, and on the surface would have solved the problem, except that it wouldn't, because the UK was still, for example, taking blood from prisoners right up until 1986. So a little bit of self-delusion there from some of the critics of this paper and book. Then the second argument is a straightforward price mechanism argument, which is if there is a voluntary system where there is no market, there is no value put on blood, then it will be undersupplied. And supply itself, demand for blood is hard to identify within the NHS at the best of times because of the absence of a market.
Yeah.
But the argument being put forward by critics like Titmus that effectively enough blood was being supplied because it was meeting clinical need is somewhat circular. And they pointed this out. And what they said was, well, you essentially got a few things you could do. You can either stick with what we've got, in which case A, will be undersupplied, and B, we will be reliant on imports because demand will be there, and the only way of meeting it at that point are the imports.
And as demand fluctuates, it's difficult to then increase supply for using just the domestic market, right?
Well, you can't. You're reliant on volunteers. I mean, you run a national campaign, and that might temporarily solve the problem, but you can't sustain that campaign but get bored with it. And people who give blood tend to give blood because they're fit and healthy, and they feel like it's something they're able to do in a volunteering system, which is great, but it's insufficient. Yeah. They then said, well, what if you had a totally market-based system? And that was something they thought might be quite good, but they accepted there were political constraints on doing that. And they partly accepted the argument of Titmus that the market system might undermine the volunteering imperative. And I'm sure that's true in some cases. But what they said is you could then have a mixed system if that was the social market model that you preferred. So you try to fuse the best of the free market approach with a moral purpose argument. And it's hard to see how that couldn't have worked, because in effect, that's exactly what they were doing anyway, just from a very dubious source, the US companies that were not screening their products properly. If there had been a proper thriving market for blood products at the time, there would have been diversity of sources. They could have then made a choice between dubious American company, dubious Austrian company, and a plethora of other suppliers from across Europe, or even at home, where the existence of that market may have created a more competitive environment where small startups brought new things into the market. At that time, it would have still been blood-based, but it might have sped up the development, for example, of recombinant plasma, which is based on turning animal cells into factories to produce the factors that enable coagulation. So the entire basis of the NHS model strangles innovation. It says, there's just something we need, we kind of know how to do it, and therefore we're going to create this system to deliver it. And if it doesn't work, well, we can always hike off somewhere else and deal with it that way, but we're not going to have a market here because we're morally opposed to markets. Well, that system delivered this scandal. And we can't say for certain whether the argument set out in the price of blood would have avoided it entirely or created incentives and pressures that might have led to better outcomes, but it does look quite likely. And we also need to get away from this idea that the problem in the blood scandal was simply dubious private markets in the US creating the problem. That's just not true. Everybody failed. from the private companies in the US to the politicians, to the clinicians, to those assessing the drugs, to those who were responsible for monitoring and supervising them, to those who then had to deal with the aftermath. None of it worked. And we need something that enables ordinary people or entrepreneurs to provide better alternatives to this kind of disaster.
I think that's really interesting, Andy. And I think, so looking at the way in which those market mechanisms could have been introduced and what a market of blood could actually look like, a market for blood could look like, and actually how those price mechanisms, those price signals could have impacted the supply and could have solved the supply issue. So it could have solved the supply issue without with there being better quality blood products. But also, as you said, it could have spurred on, or at least encouraged, innovation, which would mean that blood products themselves weren't necessarily always required in all of those instances. Could you speak just a little bit about why you think that is? Why is it those market mechanisms then spur on innovation? Why is it that unleashing that kind of liberty actually allows and encourages and incentivizes technological innovation?
Well, we have the live example from the scandal of how long it took the UK to get the hepatitis C tests out, where hepatitis C was diagnosed in 1988 and there were tests available on the market in some countries a year or so later. It took the UK all the way up until 1991. And that's because of our system. Nothing to do with markets or anything else. It is simply the NHS system is very, very bad at adapting to new information. It could not move quickly. It could not move nimbly. And over the course of the history of the NHS, we start having one of the world's best healthcare systems back in the 1940s, 50s, compared to the rest of the world. Obviously, nothing compared to now. But we're not the place where massive innovation happens. In one or two places, maybe, where we have centres of excellence. But we're highly reliant on the US healthcare system, the Swiss healthcare system based on sexual
providing those innovations in the first place. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, just from that perspective, because the fact that many of those innovations and many of the innovations that we deem so important for healthcare today, and indeed healthcare in the future and the way we treat it, hadn't happened in the UK. So why is it? Why is it that unleashing liberty and unleashing those kind of market mechanisms actually actively incentivizes further innovation?
Well, what the report calls for is patient-centred care, putting safety first. Well, that's what a market does, because the patient is your customer.
Yes.
And in the NHS system, the customer is the politicians you have to keep happy in order to get your budget. It's the regulators and the overseers in the Department of Health
and the bureaucrats
who can make your life a misery. And it's the clinicians and the staff working in the NHS who are deemed to be more important than those they are treating, which is just a disaster. It's a disaster in any system. And it's why you need to have some competitive pressure in order to raise standards and encourage them to compete with each other in order to deliver better outcomes for patients.
That's really interesting. I think, again, those market mechanisms, competitive pressures, also then has, competition has a downward pressure on prices in the first instance. So we'd see lower costs potentially as well.
To be clear, it can do, but it can also diversify the number of treatments available.
Yes.
So, I'm not entirely convinced by the argument that we would end up with a cheaper healthcare system. It's almost a market reversion of the Beveridge argument that socialised medicine would make essentially a health system unnecessary because we'd all be so healthy. Well, no, we'll use innovation to discover new things that we didn't know we wanted. And we'll get better at doing the existing treatments faster, better, cheaper.
And maybe some of those innovations would happen in the UK if we had that kind of system.
I do want to say on one point, the authors of The Price of Blood did win because there is now a price of blood in the NHS.
Yeah.
So the internal market reforms of the 1990s and under subsequent governments, Labour and Conservative, decided to retain that internal market. So there was at least some sense, even if it's a regulated price, that allows clinicians to understand the cost of the treatments they're providing.
And what does that do for volunteers or for donors themselves? I mean, the fact that there is a price of blood, technically at least, and even though it is heavily regulated, but within the internal market, there is that price of blood. That means there has been a monetary value attributed to blood products.
I don't see it. Yeah.
They don't see it. So but the impact on clinicians is that they're able to value those products themselves. I mean, how are the prices actually changed in the first instance? Is it all decided by...
It's regulated
Like that. Okay.
I mean, in inflationary terms, it's almost the same. I mean, they couldn't actually work out what the price of blood was in 1968, but they estimated it was somewhere between £3 to £7. And inflating, say, £6 to current values is somewhere similar to the price of blood today.
That's really interesting. So we've spoken about how the market mechanisms could have actually prevented potentially the scandal from happening, or indeed from, or at least just making it shown happen before then, actually been able to be more transparent. Could you tell me a little bit about the largest criticism of that's come out after the blood scandal has been that the government have effectively actively been incentivized to cover up the scandal, but also that it's the fault of big pharma, big companies over in the United States and abroad that were not transparent themselves. Do you think that actually a more marketised system would have actually allowed that transparency to occur? We would have uncovered it.
The Dr. Thomas, who went over to look at these American companies, knew the problems, knew that there were viral loads in these products, decided it didn't matter. And it's the companies that then invented the solutions. So this is just nonsense. I mean, it is perfectly possible that there are one or two companies in the pharmaceutical industry that behave unethically from time to time. And we've all seen the scandals over the course of the last 20 years. But those companies tend to fail because either they encourage politicians to regulate them out of existence, or people don't want to buy their products or be associated with them. That's the difference. The NHS will still exist long after this scandal goes into the history books alongside the Alder Hey child organ scandal, the Mid Staffordshire Trust crisis, Harold Shipman.
And why
the NHS has emerged from these scandals almost unscathed, unchanged. Still a much-loved national institution that only 2 years ago people were standing on their doorsteps cheering as they were covering up for murder.
And why is it that the ability for institutions to fail, or indeed the ability for organisations to fail, why does that then mean that there is that increase in transparency, or indeed that there would be a lower capacity or lower probability for those kind of scandals to go on for so long? What is that difference? I mean, the difference between the NHS, which can't fail because it's a government-created monopoly and is funded by taxpayers, and a private
the founder of
organisation.
Theranos, for example, who lied about creating a magical blood analysis treatment, is now in jail.
Yeah.
Or may have been recently released. I haven't checked the latest. I'm not sure anybody associated with this scandal is yet facing the same level of punishment for arguably what is a far worse crime, which is one that has resulted in killing people, whereas the other one is an example of fraud. So that is a very strong incentive not to do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or should be. And if it isn't, then you really are a psychopath.
Yeah.
Which they've covered up for as well.
Well, indeed, yeah. So, I mean, the cover-up specifically, if this was to have happened at a private organisation, the very likely situation would have been that it would have failed, or indeed that it would have been allowed to fail. But I guess the point is that the NHS isn't allowed to fail. And so there are those incentive structures that promote and again incentivise covering up those kind of scandals. I mean, if it wasn't, if this was in the private sector, it would have failed, not given 30 to 40 years to cover it up, to save face. So I think...
Bevan wanted the sound of a bedpan being dropped to be heard in the halls of Westminster, which is a mad system. I mean, a minister has no control over the detailed clinical running of health services. The fundamental service that the NHS provides is improvements to healthcare, usually for reactive treatment, but also these days also positive advice of how to maintain your own health better. And these are nothing to do with politics. The politics of it is the trade-off of resources. So somebody has to make a difficult decision as to whether we put more money into treating childhood cancer or providing safe blood products for haemophiliacs.
Yeah. And those decisions are being made by politicians and by bureaucrats rather than...
Well, mostly by bureaucrats these days, because the politicians have wisely decided that they things they know nothing about and they would rather delegate the responsibility. But the trouble is they haven't.
Yeah.
So they're still responsible. I mean, Kenneth Clarke back in the 1980s would have correctly evaluated that if he'd taken full responsibility for this scandal, he would have had to resign. And clearly decided he wasn't going to do that. But he's not the only one. Many other health ministers took the same view.
Really, really interesting analysis, Andy, of what is an incredibly tragic story. Just before we finish up, looking towards the future, how can we implement institutional mechanisms that prevent these kind of things from happening? And indeed, if they do happen, mean that we are transparent enough to not wait 30 to 40 years for them to be uncovered?
I think people should read Christian Niemitz's book, Universal Healthcare Without the NHS, which explores the comparative healthcare systems of various countries and concludes that the social insurance model that does provide universal coverage is a better one to the socialised medicine that we deliver here. Everything else is tinkering around the edges. While we have something that is second only in size to the People's Republic of China's army, it is going to be a massive Praetorian Guard and political force in public life in the UK. It is too much a state institution. It should be broken up. And if we were going to reform it intelligently in a way that might actually get through Parliament, what I'd say is that you need a personal health service, one that is deliberately and explicitly putting the patient at the centre of decision-making, such that their clinical needs and their healthcare is centred on them, not some national database of averages, let alone one which enables clinicians to experiment on them as children.
Indeed, and I suppose there's the point with the social insurance model in which patients are able to make those choices. And indeed, there are various different systems and various different international examples that we could seek to emulate. But I think that scandals like this, like the infected blood scandal, and indeed overall outcomes within the National Health Service show that the current system doesn't work. And that those kind of market mechanisms, competition between providers and choice, so that patients are able to have that kind of choice and they can choose where they get their healthcare from. I think those market mechanisms potentially could prevent scandals like this from occurring in the first place, or indeed, when they do happen, mean that those systems fail and better ones are able to re-enter the market. Thank you so much, Andy, for joining us today on this week's podcast. And thank you to all of you for listening or watching. If you enjoy the IEA's work and would like to find out more, please visit iea.org.uk.